Picture this. You're sitting down to what you think is a feast. The year is 1347. You're in a dimly lit hall surrounded by the stench of unwashed bodies and rotting food. What's placed before you? A bowl of gruel that looks like it came from a swamp. Bread so hard it could be used as a weapon. And meat that's, well, let's just say it's moving in ways that meat shouldn't move. Welcome back to the channel, history lovers. I'm about to take you on a journey that will make you kiss your modern refrigerator and thank every food safety inspector who ever lived. Today we're diving deep into the absolute nightmare that was eating in medieval times. And trust me, by the end of this video, you'll understand why the average medieval person lived to the ripe old age of, well, let's just say they didn't have time to worry about retirement plans. But before we begin this culinary horror story, smash that subscribe button, because we're about to uncover secrets that most history books won't tell you. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I love seeing our global community of history enthusiasts. Now you might be thinking, come on, how bad could medieval food really be? Oh my sweet naive friend, you have no idea what you're about to discover. We're talking about an era where spices were literally worth more than gold, where bread was a luxury item, and where the difference between food and poison was, well, sometimes there wasn't one. The medieval period wasn't just the dark ages for knowledge and technology. It was the dark ages for your taste buds, your stomach, and quite frankly, your will to live. From the peasant's hovel to the king's table, food was a daily battle for survival. And the horrifying truth is, most people lost that battle. So grab your strongest stomach medication, because we're about to feast on some truly disgusting historical facts. But first, let me ask you this. What do you think was the deadliest thing about medieval food? The lack of refrigeration, the poor sanitation, or something far more sinister that I'm about to reveal? Let's start with the most fundamental problem. There simply wasn't enough food. The medieval world was locked in a constant battle against starvation. And spoiler alert, starvation was winning. Between 1315 and 1322, Europe experienced what historians call the Great Famine. But here's what they don't tell you in school. This wasn't just 7 years of bad harvests. This was 7 years of absolute soul-crushing hell. Imagine waking up every morning not knowing if you'll eat that day, not knowing if your children will eat, not knowing if the gnawing pain in your stomach will ever stop. That was reality for millions of people. The chroniclers of the time wrote about parents selling their children for food. They wrote about people eating tree bark, grass, and things I can't even mention on a monetized YouTube channel. But here's where it gets really dark, and I need you to pay attention, because this is where most people stop listening. The Great Famine wasn't just about crop failures, it was about a complete breakdown of society. When food disappeared, so did morality, so did law, so did everything that made people human. The records from this period are absolutely chilling. In Tournai, chroniclers reported that people were digging up freshly buried corpses to eat them. In Ireland, the situation was so desperate that there are documented cases of cannibalism. And this wasn't happening in some far-off, uncivilized land. This was happening in the heart of Christian Europe, in cities with grand cathedrals and noble courts. If you're enjoying this deep dive into medieval horror, make sure to hit that like button and tell me in the comments. Have you ever experienced true hunger? Not just I skipped breakfast hunger, but real, gnawing, desperate hunger. I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we take our food security for granted today. But the Great Famine was just the beginning. Even in good years, when crops didn't fail and plagues didn't ravage the countryside, the medieval diet was a death sentence served 3 times a day. And what I'm about to tell you next will make you understand why even the kings and queens of the medieval world lived shorter lives than modern homeless people. Now, let's talk about what happened when there actually was food available. Spoiler alert, having food didn't mean you were safe. In fact, in many cases, It meant you were about to poison yourself in the most creative ways imaginable. Picture the medieval kitchen. There's no refrigeration, no understanding of bacteria, no food safety standards. Meat was left hanging in the open air for days, covered in flies and crawling with maggots. And here's the kicker, they thought this was normal. They thought the maggots were just part of the meat's natural aging process. The medieval cook's solution to meat that was clearly going bad: cover it in spices, if you could afford them, then cook it until it was charcoal. But here's what's truly terrifying. Even when they cooked meat to death, they still couldn't kill all the parasites. Tapeworms, roundworms, and other delightful creatures were just accepted as part of life. Archaeological evidence from medieval latrine. Yes, historians study medieval poop, and thank God they do. Yes, shows that intestinal parasites were universal. Everyone had them. Rich, poor, noble, peasant. Everyone was carrying around a writhing ecosystem of worms in their guts, and the medieval people knew this. They had remedies for worms, which tells you just how common and accepted this was. But wait, it gets worse. Much worse. The bread that formed the staple of the medieval diet was often contaminated with ergot molle, a fungus that contains compounds similar to LSD. Ergot poisoning, known as St. Anthony's fire, caused hallucinations, convulsions, and gangrene. Entire villages would go mad simultaneously, and they had no idea why. Before we go further down this rabbit hole of medieval food horror, I need to know, are you still with me? Drop a comment telling me the most disgusting thing you've ever eaten, and let me know where you're watching from. Trust me, whatever you've eaten, it's nothing compared to what we're about to discuss next. The contamination wasn't just accidental, either. Medieval food production was a perfect storm of ignorance, desperation, and outright fraud. Bakers mixed sawdust and chalk into bread to make it go further. Brewers used water from sources that were, well, let's just say they were downstream from some very unsanitary activities. But here's the most chilling part. The people who could afford the best food were often the ones who suffered the most. The rich consumed massive amounts of meat, which in the medieval world was basically a guaranteed ticket to gout, kidney stones, and intestinal blockages. The poor, who lived mainly on bread and porridge, at least had fiber in their diet. And speaking of the rich, wait until you hear about the dining habits of medieval nobility. What I'm about to reveal will make you question everything you thought you knew about medieval feasts and royal banquets. You've seen the movies. Have you heard the grand medieval feast? Long tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, oblets of wine, and elaborate dishes fit for a king. Well, I'm about to shatter that romantic image forever. The royal dining table wasn't a place of luxury and indulgence. It was a buffet of death, served on silver platters. Let's start with the most shocking revelation. Halls feared medieval nobility, literally poisoned themselves with their own wealth. Hall's beautiful silver and pewter plates and goblets. They were slowly killing everyone who used them. Lead poisoning was rampant among the upper classes because pewter contained massive amounts of lead, and acidic foods and drinks would leach it out. But here's where it gets really twisted. The medieval rich knew that lead made them sick, but they kept using it anyway because it made their wine taste sweeter. They were literally choosing to poison themselves for the sake of flavor. Archaeological analysis of medieval noble remains shows lead levels that would be considered lethal by today's standards. Now, about those grand feasts you see in movies. The reality was a nightmare of excess and waste that would make your stomach turn. A single feast for a medieval king could involve hundreds of different dishes, many of which would sit out for hours, attracting flies and going rancid in the heat of the Great Hall. The medieval rich had a peculiar obsession with what they called exotic foods. We're talking about dishes that were designed more to show off wealth than to actually nourish. Peacocks stuffed with smaller birds, which were stuffed with even smaller birds. Massive pies filled with live animals that would jump out when the pie was cut. Imagine the sanitation nightmare of having terrified, defecating birds flying around your dining hall. But here's the part that will really blow your mind. Medieval noble dining wasn't just about the food. It was about conspicuous consumption taken to absolutely insane extremes. Henry VIII's court records show feasts where single meals cost more than most people earned in a lifetime, and much of the food was purely decorative and inedible. If you're as shocked as I am by these revelations, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell. And I'm curious, what's the most extravagant meal you've ever had? Drop a comment and let me know where you're from. I bet it's nowhere near as dangerous as what these medieval nobles were eating. The truly horrifying part about medieval royal cuisine wasn't just the excess it was the complete ignorance about nutrition. Medieval doctors believed that different foods had different humors, and that eating the wrong combination could literally drive you insane or kill you. So the rich would create elaborate meals based on medieval medical theory, which was about as scientific as astrology. And then there was the spice obsession. Medieval nobility would cover their food in spices that cost more than gold, not for flavor, but to prove they could afford to do so. Some of these spices were so potent and poorly understood that they regularly caused poisoning. Nutmeg, for instance, was often used in quantities that would cause hallucinations and liver damage. But if you think the rich had it bad, wait until you hear about what the poor were eating. What I'm about to tell you about peasant food will make royal excess look like a picnic. Now let's talk about the other 99% of medieval society. The peasants, who lived in conditions that would make modern prisoners riot. If noble food was dangerously extravagant, peasant food was dangerously scarce, and the lengths people went to just to survive another day will haunt you. The cornerstone of peasant diet was something called maslin, a bread made from whatever grains were available, mixed with whatever fillers could be found. And when I say whatever, I mean whatever. Acorns, bark, sawdust, ground bones, and in desperate times, clay. Yes, clay. Peasants would literally eat dirt to fill their stomachs. But here's what's truly heartbreaking. Peasants knew this food was killing them, but they had no choice. Medieval records from England show that peasant families would give the best food to whoever was most likely to survive. Children and elderly were often the first to starve because they couldn't work to earn their keep. The medieval peasants' cooking method was as dangerous as the food itself. Most peasants cooked over open fires in their homes, which were basically wooden boxes filled with smoke. Food was often more smoked than cooked, and the combination of smoke inhalation and poorly cooked food meant that respiratory diseases and food poisoning were constant companions. Here's something that will blow your mind. Medieval peasants were actually shorter than their Roman ancestors because of malnutrition. The average medieval peasant was about 5–6 inches if they were lucky, and archaeological evidence shows signs of chronic malnutrition in virtually every skeleton from this period. But the most horrifying aspect of peasant cuisine was what happened during the hunger seasons. Those months between the end of the stored food and the new harvest. Peasants would eat things that would make modern survival experts cringe. Leather boiled until it was soft enough to chew, grass soup, and in the worst cases, they would eat what they called famine bread, the mixture of ground bark, clay, and whatever seeds they could find. I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. When was the last time you worried about where your next meal was coming from? Drop a comment and let me know, you watching this while eating something. Because I guarantee you, whatever you're eating right now is infinitely better than what 99% of medieval people ate their entire lives. The medieval peasants' relationship with food was fundamentally different from ours. Food wasn't about pleasure or even nutrition, it was about survival. Every meal was a victory against death, and every day you woke up hungry was a reminder that you were one bad harvest away from the grave. And here's the kicker, even when peasants had food, they couldn't keep it. Medieval lords claimed the right to tax everything: meat, brine, livestock, even the vegetables from peasant gardens. The average peasant family gave away more than half of what they produced just to stay alive. But wait until you hear about the medieval understanding of nutrition and health. What I'm about to reveal about medieval medicine and food will make you realize that sometimes ignorance isn't bliss, it's deadly. Now we enter the realm of medieval medicine, where doctors were basically licensed killers with fancy robes and complete confidence in their deadly ignorance. The medieval understanding of nutrition and health was so backward, so completely wrong, that following medical advice was often a death sentence. Medieval doctors believed in something called the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. They thought that all illness came from an imbalance of these humors, and that food could be used to restore balance. This led to some truly horrifying medical prescriptions. Here's a real medieval medical prescription that I found in a 14th century manuscript. For a patient with fever, the doctor prescribed a diet of cold foods, including raw fish, uncooked vegetables, and large quantities of ice-cold water. The patient, of course, died probably from food poisoning and hypothermia. But the doctor blamed the death on the patient's corrupt humors. But it gets worse. Medieval doctors believed that certain foods could literally change your personality or drive you insane. They thought that eating too much garlic would make you violent, that beans would cause nightmares, and that cheese would make you stupid. Rich patients would follow these dietary restrictions religiously, often starving themselves of essential nutrients. The medieval treatment for scurvy nosh, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency, was to avoid all fruits and vegetables because they were considered too moist for the body. Sailors and soldiers would die horrible deaths from scurvy, while their doctors forbade them from eating the very foods that could have saved them. Before we go deeper into this medical madness, I need to know, Midis, have you ever been given medical advice that seemed questionable? Drop a comment and tell me about it, and let me know where you're watching from. I bet it's nowhere near as deadly as medieval medical advice. Here's perhaps the most shocking example of medieval medical ignorance: bloodletting. Medieval doctors believed that most illnesses were caused by having too much blood, so they would deliberately weaken already sick patients by draining their blood. But here's the kicker: they often did this to patients who were already weakened by malnutrition and poor food quality. Medieval medical texts are filled with recipes for medicines that were essentially poison. Mercury, lead, arsenic, and other toxic substances were regularly prescribed as treatments, and these weren't rare or experimental treatment. This was standard medical practice endorsed by the most learned doctors of the time. The medieval understanding of digestion was so wrong it's almost comical. They believed that food was cooked in the stomach by body heat, and that drinking cold water would quench the fire of digestion and kill you. So people would drink warm, often contaminated water and avoid the cold, clean water that might actually have been safe. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of medieval medicine was its treatment of children. Medieval doctors believed that children's bodies were too weak to handle most foods, so they prescribed diets that were essentially starvation regimens. The result? Child mortality rates that would make modern parents weep. And speaking of children, what I'm about to tell you about medieval childhood and food will break your heart and make you hug your kids a little tighter. If you thought medieval food was bad for adults, wait until you hear what children had to endure. The medieval approach to child nutrition was a perfect storm of ignorance, poverty, and outright cruelty that resulted in mortality rates that would shock you to your core. Let's start with the most heartbreaking statistic. In medieval Europe, roughly 50% of children died before their 5th birthday, and malnutrition was the primary cause. But here's what's truly horrifying. Many of these deaths were preventable, even with medieval technology, if they had just understood basic nutrition. Medieval children were weaned onto foods that were essentially poison for developing bodies. Hard bread soaked in ale, Thin gruel made from whatever grains were available, and watered-down wine were considered appropriate foods for toddlers. The result? Chronic diarrhea, malnutrition, and developmental delays that plagued those lucky enough to survive. But the most shocking aspect of medieval child nutrition was the complete lack of understanding about what growing bodies needed. Medieval parents would give their children adult food in smaller portions, not realizing that children need different nutrients in different proportions. Rickets, scurvy, and other deficiency diseases were so common among children that they were considered normal. Here's a detail that will haunt you. Medieval medical texts contain recipes for strengthening broths for weak children. These broths were made from things like crushed eggshells, ground bones, and herbs that we now know are toxic to developing nervous systems. Parents lovingly prepared these broths, thinking they were helping their children, while actually poisoning them. If you're a parent watching this, I need you to imagine something, and I want you to really think about this. Imagine not knowing whether your child would survive to see their next birthday, and knowing that the food you're giving them might be what kills them. Drop a comment and tell me, Maddie, please, does this make you appreciate modern food safety differently? Let me know where you're watching from too. The medieval understanding of childhood development was so primitive that they believed children were just small adults who needed smaller portions of adult food. They didn't understand that children's digestive systems are different, that they need different nutrients, or that certain foods are particularly dangerous for young bodies. Medieval children, who were lucky enough to be born into wealthy families, faced a different set of nutritional horrors. They were often fed elaborate dishes that were completely inappropriate for children. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of medieval childhood nutrition was the practice of fostering, sending children to live with other families. These children were often treated as servants and given the worst food, the smallest portions, and the most dangerous tasks. Many fostered children died of malnutrition, while their host families ate relatively well. The archaeological evidence for medieval childhood malnutrition is overwhelming. Children's skeletons from this period show signs of chronic malnutrition, stunted growth, and diseases that are virtually unknown in the modern developed world. These weren't children from the poorest families. These were children from all social classes. And here's something that will make you question everything you thought you knew about medieval society. Even royal children suffered from malnutrition. The elaborate meals served at royal courts were often so rich and inappropriate that they made children sick, while the children of peasants at least got some nutrients from their simple diet of bread and vegetables. But children weren't the only vulnerable population in medieval society. What I'm about to tell you about how medieval food affected women, especially pregnant women, will make you realize that medieval society was a death trap for anyone who wasn't a healthy adult male. Medieval women faced a unique set of nutritional challenges that would make modern feminists weep with rage. In a society where women were already considered second-class citizens, their nutritional needs were ignored, dismissed, or actively sabotaged by the very medical establishment that was supposed to help them. Let's start with the most basic injustice: portion sizes. Medieval women were given smaller portions than men, not because they needed less food, but because society believed they were less important. Even pregnant women were often given less food than their husbands, based on the twisted logic that pregnancy was a woman's natural burden and didn't require extra nutrition. The medieval understanding of pregnancy nutrition was so backwards, it's almost criminal. Medieval medical texts advised pregnant women to eat less, not more, because they believed that too much food would make the baby too large and cause difficult births. The result? Generations of malnourished mothers giving birth to malnourished babies. But here's where it gets really dark. Medieval society actively restricted certain foods from pregnant women based on superstition and pseudoscience. Pregnant women were forbidden from eating fish, which contains essential omega-3 fatty acids, fruits which contain vital vitamins, and dairy products, which provide calcium. Basically everything that modern science tells us pregnant women need most. The result of this nutritional ignorance was catastrophic. Maternal mortality rates in medieval Europe were around 10 to 20%, meaning that 1 in 5 women died in childbirth. And many of these deaths were directly related to malnutrition. Women who survived childbirth were often left permanently weakened and unable to properly feed their babies. Before we continue with this heartbreaking topic, I need to ask, minds, are you a woman who's been pregnant? If so, I want you to imagine going through pregnancy while being told to eat less, not more. Drop a comment and tell me what you think about this, and let me know where you're watching from. This historical injustice needs to be remembered. Medieval women also faced unique challenges related to food preparation and safety. They were responsible for cooking and preserving food, but they were given no education about food safety or nutrition. They were expected to somehow make nutritious meals from ingredients that were often spoiled, contaminated, or simply inadequate. The medieval practice of churching, the blessing of women after childbirth, included dietary restrictions that were essentially a form of torture. New mothers were forbidden from eating meat, drinking wine, or consuming any rich foods during their recovery period. This was exactly when they needed the most nutrition to recover from childbirth and produce breast milk. Medieval women's diets were also restricted by social and religious customs. During the numerous religious fasting periods, which could add up to more than half the year, women were expected to fast just as rigorously as men, despite having different nutritional needs. Pregnant and nursing women were sometimes given exemptions, but social pressure often meant they fasted anyway. The archaeological evidence for medieval women's nutritional status is heartbreaking. Women's skeletons from this period show signs of chronic iron deficiency, calcium deficiency, and other conditions that are directly related to poor nutrition during pregnancy and breastfeeding. These weren't just peasant women. Noble women showed the same signs of malnutrition. But if you think medieval understanding of women's nutrition was bad, wait until you hear about their understanding of food preservation and storage. What I'm about to tell you about medieval food storage will make you understand why refrigeration was one of the greatest inventions in human history. Let's talk about one of the most fundamental problems of medieval food preservation. Without refrigeration, without proper understanding of bacteria, and without effective preservation methods, medieval food storage was basically a science experiment in how to create the perfect breeding ground for deadly microorganisms. Medieval meat preservation was a nightmare that would make modern food safety inspectors faint. The primary method was salting, but medieval salt was often contaminated with dirt, animal waste, and other delightful substances. Meat would be packed in this contaminated salt and left to cure in cellars that were damp, dark, and crawling with rats. But here's what's truly horrifying. Medieval people knew their preserved meat was going bad, but they had no choice but to eat it anyway. They developed elaborate systems of spices and cooking methods specifically designed to mask the taste and smell of rotting meat. If you could afford spices, you could eat rotten meat without gagging. If you couldn't afford spices, you ate rotten meat and tried not to think about it. The medieval method of preserving meat in fat mined, it's called confit. Sounds sophisticated, but in practice, it was often a disaster. Meat would be cooked in animal fat, and then stored in containers that were rarely properly cleaned. The fat would go rancid, creating a toxic environment that actually made the meat more dangerous than if it had been left to rot naturally. Medieval grain storage was equally horrifying. Grain was stored in wooden barrels and sacks that were perfect breeding grounds for mold, insects, and rodents. The most common grain storage method involved digging pits in the ground and lining them with straw mined, essentially creating underground pools of rotting grain that were poisonous to anyone who ate them. Here's a question I want you to really think about. When was the last time you threw away food because it was starting to go bad? Drop a comment and tell me, what's the oldest thing in your refrigerator right now? because I guarantee you, it's fresher than the best preserved food in medieval times. The medieval understanding of food spoilage was based on the miasma theory, the belief that bad air caused disease. So they would store food in sealed containers to keep out the bad air, not realizing that they were creating perfect anaerobic environments for botulism and other deadly bacteria. Medieval dairy preservation was perhaps the most dangerous of all. Without pasteurization or proper refrigeration, milk and cheese were essentially time bombs. Fresh milk would last hours in summer heat before becoming deadly. Cheese was often made from milk that was already contaminated, creating wheels of cheese that were more weapon than food. The seasonal nature of medieval food preservation meant that by the end of winter, most preserved foods were barely edible. The hunger gap between winter stores and spring crops wasn't just about quantity. It was about eating foods that had been slowly poisoning people for months. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of medieval food preservation was the complete lack of quality control. There were no standards, no inspections, no regulations. Anyone could preserve food using any method they wanted, and the results were often deadly. Entire families would die from eating improperly preserved food, and no one would know why. And speaking of deadly ignorance, what I'm about to tell you about medieval beverages will make you never take clean water for granted again. If you thought medieval food was bad, wait until you hear about what people drank. Medieval beverages were often more dangerous than the most contaminated food, and the medieval understanding of water safety was so primitive that clean water was literally a matter of life and death. Let's start with the most basic beverage, water. Medieval people knew that water could make you sick, but they didn't understand why. Their solution was to avoid water entirely and drink alcohol instead. Even children were given weak ale or wine because it was considered safer than water. And in many cases they were right mind, but for all the wrong reasons. Medieval ale was the primary beverage for most people, but it was nothing like modern beer. It was often made from moldy grain, contaminated water, and whatever herbs could be found to mask the taste. The alcohol content was low enough that it didn't kill all the bacteria, but high enough to create a perfect environment for certain types of harmful microorganisms. Medieval wine was equally dangerous. Without proper fermentation control, medieval wine was often contaminated with bacteria that caused severe intestinal distress. Wine was also commonly adulterated with lead compounds to make it sweeter, creating a beverage that was slowly poisoning everyone who drank it. But here's the most shocking part. Medieval people were literally dying of thirst while surrounded by water. They were so afraid of waterborne illness that they would drink contaminated alcohol instead of clean water. The result was chronic dehydration, combined with alcohol poisoning, a deadly combination that contributed to the short lifespan of medieval people. I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. When was the last time you worried about whether the water coming out of your tap was safe to drink? Drop a comment and tell me is do you take clean water for granted? Let me know where you're watching from, because access to clean water is still a luxury that many people in the world don't have. Medieval water sources were contaminated with everything you can imagine, and several things you probably can't. Wells were often dug near latrines, graveyards, and animal waste areas. Rivers were used simultaneously for drinking water, waste disposal, and industrial processes like tanning leather and dyeing cloth. The medieval practice of adding herbs and spices to beverages wasn't just for flavor, it was an attempt to mask the taste of contamination. Medieval people would add things like wormwood, henbane, and other toxic plants to their drinks, not realizing they were making them more dangerous, not less. Medieval milk was perhaps the most dangerous beverage of all. Without pasteurization, fresh milk was a breeding ground for tuberculosis, brucellosis, and other deadly diseases. But medieval people believed that milk was essential for children and pregnant women, so they continued to give it to the most vulnerable members of society. The seasonal nature of medieval beverages meant that by the end of winter, most stored drinks were barely consumable. Ale would turn sour, wine would turn to vinegar, and stored water would become thick with algae and bacteria. Yet people had no choice but to drink these contaminated beverages or die of thirst. But if you think medieval beverages were dangerous, wait until you hear about the social and economic forces that made medieval food even more deadly than it needed to be. Now we get to the most infuriating part of the medieval food story. Much of the suffering was completely unnecessary. Medieval food wasn't just bad because of ignorance or technology. It was bad because of greed, corruption, and a social system that prioritized profit over human life. Let's start with the most shocking revelation. Medieval merchants regularly adulterated food to increase profits. Bread was mixed with sawdust, chalk, and ground bones. Wine was watered down and mixed with toxic chemicals to restore color. Milk was diluted with contaminated water. And all of this was completely legal because there were no food safety regulations. The medieval guild system, which is often romanticized in modern times, was actually a cartel system that kept food prices artificially high and quality artificially low. Bakers' guilds would fix prices and standards, ensuring that bread remained expensive and often adulterated. Anyone who tried to sell better bread at lower prices would be shut down by the guild. Medieval lords had the legal right to force peasants to use their mills, ovens, and breweries, and they charged exorbitant fees for these services. Peasants were forbidden from grinding their own grain or baking their own bread, forcing them to pay fees that often left them without enough food to survive. This wasn't just taxation medieval, it was legalized starvation. But here's the most enraging part. Medieval society had the technology and knowledge to produce enough food for everyone. The problem wasn't scarcity, was distribution. While peasants starved, nobles would throw elaborate feasts where more food was wasted than most people saw in a year. Before we continue with this infuriating topic, I need to know, does this remind you of anything in the modern world? Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever seen food waste that made you angry? Let me know where you're watching from, because food waste and inequality are still major issues today. The medieval tax system was designed to extract as much food as possible from peasants while giving them nothing in return. Peasants were taxed on everything: grain, livestock, vegetables, even the fruit from trees on their own land. In bad years, these taxes would take more food than peasants could afford to give, literally taxing them to death. Medieval food markets were rigged in favor of the wealthy. Merchants would buy up grain during harvest season when it was cheap, then sell it back to the same peasants at inflated prices during the winter. This practice, called engrossing, was officially illegal, but widely practiced because the penalties were minimal for those who could afford to pay them. The medieval church, which preached about charity and caring for the poor, was often the worst offender when it came to food inequality. Monasteries would accumulate vast amounts of land and food while the peasants who worked that land starved. The church's own records show that they often had enough grain stored to feed entire regions, but they would let it rot rather than distribute it to the hungry. Medieval warfare made food inequality even worse. Armies would sweep through countryside, seizing food from peasants and leaving them to starve. This wasn't collateral damage, it was deliberate strategy. Starving your enemy's peasants was considered a legitimate military tactic. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of medieval food economics was the complete lack of emergency planning. Medieval societies knew that famines were inevitable, but they made no systematic effort to prepare for them. Instead, they relied on the same market forces that had created the problem in the first place. And speaking of planning, what I'm about to tell you about medieval cooking methods will make you kiss your modern kitchen appliances. Let's step inside a medieval kitchen, and I guarantee you'll never complain about your cooking situation again. Medieval cooking wasn't just primitive, it's a daily dance with death that claimed countless lives through burns, poisoning, and outright disasters. Medieval cooking was done over open fires in buildings that were essentially wooden tinderboxes. House fires were so common that they were considered a normal part of life. Entire neighborhoods would burn down because someone's cooking fire got out of control. And here's the kicker: when your house burned down, you didn't just lose your shelter, you lost your food stores, your cooking equipment, and often your life. The medieval kitchen was filled with smoke from poorly ventilated fires. Medieval cooks suffered from chronic respiratory problems, eye damage, and carbon monoxide poisoning. They were literally being poisoned by their own cooking methods, but they had no choice because it was the only way to prepare food. Medieval cooking vessels were often made from materials that were toxic when heated. Lead-glazed pottery would leach lead into food when heated. Copper pots would create toxic compounds when used with acidic foods. Iron pots would rust and contaminate food with metal particles. Medieval cooks were unknowingly poisoning their families with their own cookware. Kitchen accidents were so common in medieval times that they were a leading cause of death, especially among women. Burns, scalds, and cuts were routine occurrences. Without proper medical care, a simple kitchen accident could easily become infected and kill you. Medieval women lived in constant fear of the very kitchens they were expected to work in. Medieval cooking tools were primitive and dangerous. Knives were often dull and poorly made, leading to more accidents. Grinding stones would shed particles of stone into flour. Wooden spoons and bowls were impossible to clean properly, becoming breeding grounds for bacteria. Every tool in the medieval kitchen was a potential weapon against the person using it. I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. What's the most dangerous thing in your kitchen? Drop a comment and tell me, Medias, have you ever had a serious cooking accident? Let me know where you're watching from, because I bet your worst kitchen disaster is nothing compared to what medieval cooks faced every day. Medieval food preparation was a race against time and bacteria. Without refrigeration, food had to be prepared and eaten quickly, but without proper heat control, food was often either burned to charcoal or left dangerously undercooked. Medieval cooks had to choose between food that was inedible and food that was potentially deadly. The medieval understanding of food temperature was based on touch and guesswork. They had no thermometers, no understanding of safe cooking temperatures, and no way to tell if food was properly cooked. Medieval cooks would test meat by poking it with dirty fingers, spreading contamination while trying to determine if the food was safe to eat. Medieval spice preparation was particularly dangerous. Spices were often ground on stones that were also used for other purposes, including grinding medicines and other substances. Cross-contamination was inevitable, and medieval cooks would unknowingly mix food spices with toxic substances. The seasonal nature of medieval cooking meant that cooking methods would change dramatically throughout the year. In winter, when fuel was scarce, food was often barely cooked. In summer, when fires were dangerous, food was often left to cook too long, burning and creating toxic compounds. But if you think medieval cooking was dangerous, wait until you hear about medieval food storage and the creatures that lived in medieval pantries. Imagine sitting down to eat and hearing the sound of tiny feet scampering across your table. Now imagine that this is completely normal, expected, and unavoidable. Welcome to medieval dining, where every meal was shared with an army of uninvited guests that would make modern health inspectors run screaming. Medieval food storage was a paradise for pests. Grain stores were infested with weevils, rats, and mice. Meat hanging in pantries was covered with flies and maggots. Even the most carefully prepared food would be contaminated by insects, rodents, and other creatures that medieval people simply accepted as part of life. Rats weren't just a nuisance in medieval times, they were a constant threat to survival. A single rat family could destroy enough grain to feed a human family for weeks. But here's the truly horrifying part. Medieval people knew their food was contaminated with rat droppings, rat urine, and sometimes dead rats. But they ate it anyway because they had no choice. Medieval bread often contained bonus protein in the form of weevils, beetles, and other insects that had infested the grain. Medieval people would pick out the visible insects and eat the bread anyway. Some medieval texts actually describe techniques for determining whether bread had too many insects to be edible. Medieval attempts at pest control were often worse than the pests themselves. Cats were kept in food storage areas, but they also defecated and urinated in the same spaces where food was stored. Dogs were used to catch rats, but they also contaminated food with their waste and parasites. The cure was often worse than the disease. But the most shocking aspect of medieval pest control was the complete acceptance of contamination. Medieval people didn't just tolerate pest contamination. They developed elaborate systems for dealing with it. They would sift grain to remove the largest insects, skim maggots off the surface of preserved meat, and scrape mold off cheese and bread. Before we continue with this disgusting topic, I need to know, what's the most disgusting thing you've ever found in your food? Drop a comment and tell me about it, and let me know where you're watching from. I bet it's nowhere near as bad as what medieval people ate regularly. Medieval storage containers were designed more to keep pests out than to keep food fresh, but they failed at both tasks. Wooden barrels and sacks were easily chewed through by rats and mice. Clay pots were cracked and broken, allowing insects to enter. Even the most expensive storage containers were no match for medieval pests. The seasonal nature of pest problems meant that medieval food contamination followed predictable patterns. In spring, when pest populations were lowest, food was relatively clean. By autumn, when pest populations peaked, food was so contaminated that it was often more pest than food. Medieval texts contain detailed descriptions of different types of food contamination and how to deal with them. These weren't emergency procedures, they were everyday cooking instructions. Medieval cookbooks routinely included recipes for making food palatable despite heavy contamination. The medieval understanding of pest-borne disease was virtually non-existent. They knew that pests were undesirable, but they didn't understand that they carried diseases. Medieval people would eat food that was contaminated with disease-carrying pests while taking elaborate precautions against imaginary threats like bad air and evil humors. But pests weren't the only creatures that medieval people had to worry about. What I'm about to tell you about medieval parasites will make you grateful for modern deworming treatments. Now we enter the most disgusting chapter of medieval food history, the universal presence of parasites. Every single person in medieval Europe was host to multiple species of worms, flukes, and other internal parasites. This wasn't a problem for some people. It was a problem for everyone, from the lowliest peasant to the highest king. Archaeological evidence from medieval latrines shows that intestinal parasites were so common that they were considered a normal part of human anatomy. Medieval people didn't wonder if they had worms gnat. They wondered how many worms they had and what types. The medieval understanding of digestion included worms as essential participants in the process. The medieval diet was perfectly designed to spread parasites. Undercooked meat was infested with tapeworms and roundworms. Contaminated water carried liver flukes and other waterborne parasites. Even vegetables grown in human waste were contaminated with parasites that could survive in the human body for years. Medieval medical texts describe symptoms of parasitic infection as normal aspects of human health. Chronic diarrhea, abdominal pain, and weakness were considered signs of a healthy digestive system working properly. Medieval doctors would prescribe treatments for parasites, but these treatments were often more dangerous than the parasites themselves. The medieval understanding of parasites was based on the theory of spontaneous generation, the belief that worms and other parasites were created by the body itself when it was out of balance. This meant that treatments focused on balancing the body's humors rather than eliminating the actual parasites. Before we go deeper into this disgusting topic, I need to ask, Neville ever had a parasitic infection? Drop a comment and tell me about it, and let me know where you're watching from. Modern deworming treatments are incredibly effective, but medieval people had no such luck. Medieval parasite treatments were often more dangerous than the parasites themselves. Mercury, arsenic, and other toxic substances were regularly used to purge worms from the body. These treatments would often kill the patient along with the parasites, but medieval doctors considered this an acceptable risk. The social aspects of medieval parasites were as disturbing as the medical aspects. Parasites were so common that they were mentioned in everyday conversation. Medieval people would discuss their worms the way modern people discuss the weather. Children would play games involving the worms they passed, and adults would compare the sizes and types of their parasites. Medieval parasites weren't just uncomfortable, they were debilitating. Chronic parasitic infections caused malnutrition, anemia, and organ damage. Medieval people were literally being eaten alive from the inside, but they had no effective way to stop it. The economic impact of medieval parasites was enormous. Parasitic infections reduced productivity, shortened lifespans, and created a population that was chronically ill and malnourished. The medieval economy was essentially powered by people who were slowly dying from parasitic infections. But parasites weren't the only internal threat that medieval people faced. What I'm about to tell you about medieval food poisoning will make you appreciate modern food safety regulations. Let's talk about the foods that medieval people considered delicacies, poison, foods that were so toxic. They would be classified as poison by modern standards. Medieval high cuisine wasn't just bad food made fancy. It was an elaborate system of slow-motion suicide, disguised as gourmet dining. Medieval wealthy people had an obsession with exotic ingredients that were often deadly. Cinnabar, a mercury-containing mineral, was used as a red food coloring. Orpiment, an arsenic compound, was used to create yellow colors in food. Medieval nobles were literally painting their food with poison because they thought it looked more appetizing. The medieval practice of using gold and silver leaf in food wasn't just about showing off wealth. It was about consuming metals that medieval people believed had magical properties. But gold and silver leaf were often contaminated with lead, mercury, and other toxic metals. Medieval nobles were eating heavy metals while thinking they were consuming the essence of divinity. Medieval cooking methods often created toxic compounds that didn't exist in the original ingredients. Meat roasted over certain types of wood would be contaminated with toxic compounds. Bread baked in ovens, lined with lead-glazed tiles, would absorb lead. Even the act of cooking was creating new ways to poison people. The medieval obsession with aphrodisiac foods led to the regular consumption of substances that were often deadly. Spanish fly, a beetle that contains a compound that causes kidney failure, was regularly consumed by medieval nobles who believed it would enhance their sexual performance. The result was often death rather than romance. Medieval medicinal foods were often more toxic than any disease they were supposed to cure. Foods prepared with mercury, antimony, and arsenic were regularly consumed by people who thought they were improving their health. Medieval medicine was essentially a system of slow poisoning disguised as healthcare. I need to ask you something, and I want you to really think about this. What's the most exotic food you've ever eaten? Drop a comment and tell me about it, and let me know where you're watching from. I bet it's nowhere near as dangerous as what medieval people considered normal cuisine. Medieval preservation methods often created toxic compounds that didn't exist in fresh food. Smoked meats were often contaminated with carcinogenic compounds from the wood used for smoking. Pickled vegetables were often contaminated with toxic bacteria that thrived in acidic environments. Even the act of preserving food was creating new dangers. The medieval understanding of food safety was based on appearance. taste and smell rather than actual safety. Foods that looked, tasted and smelled good were considered safe, even if they contained deadly toxins. Foods that looked unappetizing were considered dangerous, even if they were perfectly safe. Medieval food adulteration wasn't just about adding cheap ingredients. It was about adding toxic ingredients that were cheaper than safe alternatives. Lead compounds were added to wine because they were cheaper than sugar. Chalk was added to bread because it was cheaper than flour. Medieval merchants were literally selling poison disguised as food. The seasonal nature of medieval food toxicity meant that certain times of year were more dangerous than others. Spring foods were often contaminated with toxic plants that were mistaken for edible ones. Summer foods were often contaminated with bacteria that thrived in warm weather. Autumn foods were often contaminated with fungal toxins that developed during storage. But if you think medieval food was dangerous for adults, wait until you hear about the special dangers that medieval children faced. As we reach the end of our journey through medieval food hell, let's talk about the ultimate victims of this nutritional nightmare: the children, the elderly and the sick, who had no choice but to eat what was given to them, even when it was slowly killing them. Medieval children were the canaries in the coal mine of food safety. Their developing bodies were more susceptible to toxins, more vulnerable to malnutrition, and more likely to die from food-borne illnesses. The medieval child mortality rate wasn't just a statistic mine. It was a direct result of a food system that was designed to kill the most vulnerable. The elderly in medieval society faced a different set of food-related challenges. Their aging bodies couldn't process the toxins and contaminants that younger people might survive. Medieval old age was often a slow death by accumulated food poisoning, malnutrition, and the cumulative effects of a lifetime of eating contaminated food. Medieval sick people were given special diets that were supposed to help them recover, but these diets were often more dangerous than the original illness. Sick people were given strengthening broths made from contaminated ingredients, purifying teas made from toxic plants, and healing foods that were loaded with heavy metals and other poisons. The medieval understanding of nutrition for vulnerable populations was based on superstition rather than science. Pregnant women were given foods that were supposed to influence the baby's appearance or personality. Sick people were given foods based on the color of their symptoms. Children were given foods based on astrological calculations rather than nutritional needs. Before we conclude this horrifying journey, I need to ask you one final question. After hearing all of this, what are you most grateful for about modern food? Drop a comment and tell me, what modern food convenience do you think you'd miss the most if you lived in medieval times? Let me know where you're watching from, because I want to hear from our global community. The archaeological evidence for medieval food-related deaths is overwhelming. Skeletons from medieval cemeteries show signs of malnutrition, food poisoning, and toxicity that would be shocking by modern standards. These weren't people who died from diseases or accident. These were people who were slowly killed by their own food supply. Medieval food wasn't just bad, it was a systematic attack on human health that lasted for centuries. The combination of ignorance, poverty, greed, and superstition created a perfect storm of nutritional disaster that claimed millions of lives. But perhaps the most tragic aspect of medieval food history is how preventable much of the suffering was. Many of the problems that plagued medieval food could have been solved with knowledge and techniques that were available at the time. The real tragedy wasn't that medieval people didn't know better. It's that the social and economic systems of the time prevented them from doing better. The medieval food system was a mirror of medieval society itself, brutal, unfair, and designed to benefit the few at the expense of the many. The same social forces that created medieval serfdom and feudalism also created a food system that was toxic, inadequate, and deadly. So here we are, at the end of our journey through the nightmare that was medieval food. We've seen how ignorance, poverty, greed, and superstition combined to create a food system that was essentially a slow-motion genocide that lasted for centuries. But this isn't just a story about the past mess. It's a story about the present. Every time you turn on a tap and drink clean water, you're experiencing a miracle that medieval people could only dream of. Every time you open a refrigerator and find fresh food, you're living a life of luxury that medieval kings couldn't imagine. The medieval food story teaches us that food safety isn't just about convenience. It's about human dignity, social justice, and the right to live without fear of being poisoned by your next meal. The regulations that ensure our food is safe, the technologies that keep it fresh, and the systems that distribute it fairly are among humanity's greatest achievements. But we're not done learning from medieval food history. In a world where millions still go hungry, where food-borne illnesses still claim lives, and where access to nutritious food is still determined by wealth and geography, the lessons of medieval food are more relevant than ever. The medieval period teaches us that food is never just about food, it's about power, justice, knowledge, and the kind of society we choose to build. The same social forces that created medieval food hell are still at work in our world today, and it's up to us to recognize them and fight against them. So the next time you sit down to a meal, remember the millions of people who died horrible deaths because they had no choice but to eat contaminated, poisoned, inadequate food. Remember that the food on your plate represents centuries of human progress, scientific advancement, and social evolution. And remember that this progress is fragile, that it requires constant vigilance, and that it's our responsibility to ensure that the horrors of medieval food remain in the past where they belong. If this video has opened your eyes to the horrors of medieval food and the miracles of modern food safety, please hit that subscribe button. Give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to appreciate their next meal a little more. And don't forget to drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what you're most grateful for about modern food. The medieval kitchen of death is closed forever, but the lessons it teaches us will echo through history. The question is, are we listening? Thanks for joining me on this horrifying journey through medieval food history. Make sure you're subscribed with notifications on, because next week we're diving into medieval medicine. And trust me, it makes medieval food look like a picnic. Drop a comment telling me what shocked you most about medieval food, and let me know where you're watching from. I read every single comment, and your engagement helps this channel grow. Until next time, remember, every meal is a miracle, every glass of clean water is a gift, and every day you don't die from food poisoning is a victory over the forces that once made medieval food a literal nightmare. See you in the next video, and may your food always be safe, nutritious, and delicious.